Okay, hello, seventh block. Well, this is your reading homework that is due for this Friday, April 12th. Okay, so it's pages 40 through, 41 through 69. I'm gonna do it in three segments, just like last time. Just a reminder that you need three annotations for this reading, and look at your reading assignment sheet if you need to know the format of the annotations. I'm just gonna go ahead and start. So I'm going to start on page 41. So page 41. Only 6 of them had long sheepskin coats. They took turns wearing the long coats. They were for the ones who manned the watchtowers. And once again they were lined up by fives and recounted by the escorts. It's always coldest at dawn, the captain explained, because that's the last stage of the loss of heat by radiation which takes place at night. The captain liked to explain things. He could figure out the phases of the moon, whether new or old, for any day of the year. The captain was clearly going downhill. His cheeks were caved in, but he kept his spirits up. The cold here outside the camp with the wind blowing was biting Shukof's face, even though it could take almost anything by now. He knew he'd have the wind in his face like this all the way to the power plant, so he put his piece of rag over it. Like many of the others, he had a rag with 2 long tapes to use when the wind was in his face. A rag like this really helped. Shukov put it around his face, right up to his eyes, ran the tapes under his ears, and tied them behind his head. Then he covered the back of his neck with the flap of his cap and pulled up the collar of his jacket. Then he pulled down the front flap over his forehead, so all you could do was see his eyes. He tightened his coat around his middle with a rope. Now everything was okay. Only his mittens were thin and his hands were already frozen. He rubbed them and clapped them together. He knew that at any moment he'd have to put them behind his back and keep them there for the rest of the day, or rest of the way. The commander of the escort read the daily sermon, which everyone was fed up with. Your attention, prisoners! You will keep strict column order on the line of the march. You will not straggle or bunch up. You will not change places from one rank of 5 to another. You will not talk or look around to either side, and you will keep your arms behind you. A step to right or left will be considered an attempt at escape, and the escort will open fire without warning. First rank, forward, march. The first 2 escort guards must have already started along the road. In front, the column swayed. Men began to swing their shoulders, and the escort guards, 20 paces at either side of the column, and with 10 paces between them, started off, their Tommy guns at the ready. There hadn't been any new snow for a week now, and the road was well trodden. They went around the edge of the camp, and the wind hit them sideways. Hands behind backs and heads lowered, the column started off as if to a funeral. All you could see was the legs of 2 or 3 people in front of you, and the bit of trampled ground under your feet. From time to time a guard shouted, Y, 47, put your hands behind you. B, 502, keep up there. Then even they began to shout less often. The wind whipped them and made it hard for them to see, and they weren't allowed to use face rags. It was no fun for them either. Everyone talks in the column when it's warmer, no matter how much they're shouted at. But today everyone was bent forward, hiding behind the back of the man in front and thinking his own thoughts. Even a prisoner's thoughts weren't free, but kept coming back to the same thing. Kept turning to the same things over again. Will they find that bread in the mattress? Will the medics put me back on the sick list this evening? Will they put the captain in the cooler or not? And where did Caesar get that warm shirt? He must have gotten out of somebody in the stores with a bribe. Where else? Since he had no bread at breakfast and what he'd eaten was cold, Shukov felt really hungry today, and to keep his belly from whining and asking for food, he stopped thinking about the camp and thought instead about the letter that he'd soon be sending home. The column marched past the carpentry workshop built by the prisoners, past a block of living quarters, also built by the prisoners but also for free workers, and past a new club, also the work of prisoners, from the foundations to the decorations on the walls. But it was only the free ones who saw the movies there. The column came out into the steppe with the wind right in their faces, and there was a red sunrise. Bare white snow lay as far as the eye could see, and there wasn't a tree in sight. It was the beginning of a new year, 1951, and Shukov was allowed to write 2 letters home this year. He'd sent his last one off in July and had an answer in October. In Ujtisma, there had been a different system. You could write once a month if you wanted, but what can you say in a letter? He hadn't written any more often there. He had left home on the 23rd of June, 1941. One Sunday morning, people had come back from the church in Polymnia and said the war had started. They had heard about the Polymnia post office, but in Timgenyovo, I cannot do pronunciations, the village he lived, no one had a radio before the war. Now they wrote there was piped radio in every hut blaring all the time. Writing now was like throwing stones into a bottomless pit. They fell down and disappeared and no sound came back. What was the point of telling them what gang you worked in and what your boss was like? Now you had more in common with the Latvian Gilgas and you're with your own family. Anyway, they only wrote twice a year, and you couldn't make out how they were getting along. They told you there was a new boss in the kolkhoz, but there was nothing new about that. They had a new one every year. Or the kolkhoz had been amalgamated, but there was nothing new either. They were always amalgamating them and splitting them up again. Or somebody hadn't done his work quota and had his private plot cut down to 3/8 of an acre, and others had lost it all. The thing Shukov didn't get at all was what his wife wrote about, how not a single new member had come to the kolkhoz since the war. All the youngsters were getting out as best as they could to factories in the towns or to the peat fields. Half the kolkhozniks had not come back after the war, and those who had wouldn't have anything to do with the kolkhoz. They lived there but earned their money somewhere outside. The only men in the kolkhoz were the gang boss, Zahar Vasilyevich, and the carpenter Tikhon, who was 84, had married not long ago, and even had children already. The real work in the kolkhoz was done by the same woman who had been there since the start in 1930. The thing Shukov just couldn't figure out was these people living on the farm but working outside. Shukov had seen how it was on both individual and collective farms, but the idea of peasants not working in their own village, that he just couldn't take. Did they go off to seasonal work or something? And what did they do about getting the hay in? His wife told him they'd given up seasonal work a long time ago. They didn't do any carpentry anymore. I think their village was known for everywhere, and they didn't weave baskets anymore. Okay, guys, the main thing you want to get out of those last couple pages, the main thing you want to focus on is all that's happening is that he's just talking about his wife's letters and how his wife has told him about the things that have changed in their village. That's pretty much all that's happening. All right, we'll keep going. Who wanted that sort of thing nowadays? But now they were onto something new, painting carpets. Someone had gotten a hold of some stencils in the war, and the thing had really caught on. More and more people were doing it and getting good at it. They didn't have any regular jobs, and they helped in the kolkhoz for only a month of the year, getting the hay in and harvesting. And they got a paper from the kolkhoz to say that for the other 11 months, they'd been let off to take care of their own business and that they owed no taxes. They went all over the country and even flew in planes because their time was valuable. They raked in thousands of rubles, painting carpets all over the place. They got 50 rubles for a carpet painted on some old sheet. These carpets, they said, could be finished in an hour. His wife hoped he'd be back one day and become one of these painters. Then they'd get out of the poverty with which she was struggling, send the children to technical school, and put up a new hut in place of the rotten old shack they were living in now. All these carpet painters were putting up new houses, and nowadays it costs you 25,000 rubles, not like 5,000 in the old days to build a house near the railroad. Then he wrote back to his wife and asked her to tell him how the hell could he be a carpet painter if he had never been able to draw. And what was so great about these carpets? What did they put on them? His wife wrote back that any fool could make them. You just put on the stencil and Dad paint through the holes. There were 3 kinds. One, the troika, had a picture of a carriage drawn by 3 horses with beautiful harnesses and a hussar inside. The second was the stag, and the third was imitation Persian. There weren't any other patterns, but people all over the country were glad enough of even these and couldn't get their hands on them fast enough, because a real carpet doesn't cost 50 rubles, it costs thousands. Shukov would have given a lot to see these carpets. And all the time he had been in camps and prisons, Ivan Denisovich had gotten out of the habit of worrying about the next day or the next year, much less how to feed his family. The fellows at the top thought about everything for him, and it was kind of easier like that. Winter after winter, summer after summer, he still had a long time to go. But this business about the carpets upset him. It looked like an easy, surefire way of making money, and it would be sort of wrong if he didn't keep up with the other fellows in the village. But deep down inside, Ivan Denisovich did not want to have anything to do with this carpet business. You had to have a lot of gall, and you had to know how to grease the right palm. Okay, guys, when he says grease the right palm, that means bribing someone. So even though his wife wants him to get this job as a carpet painter, to get this good job as a carpet painter, you have to bribe others. And Shukov is not willing to bribe others. So Shukov is not willing to do that. That's a very important part. Okay, to grease the right palm. Shukov had been walking this earth for 40 years. He had lost half his teeth, and he was getting bald. He had never given or taken a bribe from anybody, and he hadn't learned that trick in the camp either. Easy money doesn't weigh anything, and it doesn't give you that good feeling you get when you really earn it. The old saying was true: what you don't pay for honestly, you don't get good value for. Shukov's hands were still good for something. Back home, he'd surely find work making stoves or something in the carpentry line, or mending pots and pans. The only catch was, if you'd been convicted with loss of civil rights, you couldn't get work anywhere and you weren't allowed back home. So maybe it would have to be those carpets after all. So again, guys, keep in mind, right? He knows that to get this good job as being a carpet painter, he would have to bribe someone, and he really doesn't want to do that because he's not that type of person. Let's keep going. The column had now arrived and stopped in front of the guard room of the vast compound where the building site was. A little before that, two of the escorts in sheepskin coats had peeled off at a corner of the compound and made for the watchtowers at the far end. The prisoners would only be let in when the watchtowers had been manned. The officer in charge, with a Tommy gun over his shoulder, went to the guardhouse, and there were great clouds of smoke pouring out of the guardroom chimney. They had a watchman there all night, a free worker, not a prisoner, so boards and cement wouldn't be stolen. The big red sun, sort of covered in mist, was slanting through the wires of the gate, across the whole compound, and through the wire far over on the other side. Alushka, at Shukov's side, looked at the sun and rejoiced. A smile came to his lips. His cheeks were sunken. He lived only on his ration and didn't earn anything extra. What was he so pleased about all the time? On Sundays, he spent all the time whispering with the other Baptists. The camp didn't worry them. It was like water off a duck's back. Shukov's face rug had gotten all wet from his breath on the way, and it was frozen and turned into an icy crust. He shoved it off his face onto his neck and stood with his back to the wind. He wasn't cold all the way through, but his hands were frozen in the thin mittens, and the toes of his left foot had gotten numb. It was that left boot which had a hole burned in it and had to be sewed up again. He had an aching pain all the way from the small of his back to his shoulders, so how could he work? He looked around and caught sight of the gang boss. He was at the end of the column. He had powerful shoulders and a large face. He looked grim. He didn't stand for any blank nonsense in the gang, but he kept them pretty well fed and was always worried about getting them a good ration. He was doing his good sentence, and he had practically lived all his life in the camps. What he didn't know about the camps wasn't worth knowing. In a camp, your gang boss is everything. A good one can give you a new lease on life, but a bad one will finish you off. Shukov had known Tyran in the old Uz-Ishma days, only he wasn't in his gang there. And when prisoners sentenced under Article 58 had been switched from the ordinary camp at Uz-Ishma to the penal camp, Tyran had picked him out. Shukov never had any dealings with the commandant, the PPS, the work supervisors, and the engineers. The boss took care of all that sort of thing. He was like a rock, but he only had to raise an eyebrow or point a finger, and you ran off to do what he wanted. You could cheat anyone you liked in the camp, but not Tyran. That way you would stay alive. Shukov wanted to ask him if they were going to work in the same place like yesterday, or if they were going to another place, but he didn't dare break in on his thoughts. He'd only just wangled them out of the socialist community development, and now he must have been figuring out how to get them good rates for the job, and the ration for the next 5 days depended on this. Tyran's face was covered with large pockmarks. He could face the wind without wincing. The skin on his face was tough, like the bark of an oak tree. All right, guys, that's the end of segment 1. I have 2 more segments after this, so go ahead and go do your annotation, then go on to the next segment. God bless you.